Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's JFK Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. Today, we'll be discussing and analyzing President Biden's first 100 days in office. My name is Nicole Alexander, and I'm a freshman at Harvard College, intending to study government and economics. Although next semester I will hopefully be living in Kirkland House, I'm currently zooming in from Clifton, New Jersey. This semester, I have had the honor of working as a liaison for national political reporter for the Los Angeles Times and IOP 2021 fellow Janet Hook as a part of the Fellows and Study Groups program at the IOP. The Fellows and Study Groups program invites students to have honest, candid, and off-the-record conversations about politics. Throughout her time as an IOP fellow, Janet Hook has conducted 5 study groups that invited students to discuss President Biden's first 100 days in office. As the Biden administration approaches 100 days of governing, there are signs of legislative and political successes, those of which include $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief packages, accelerated distribution of vaccines, the American Jobs Plan, and a $2.3 trillion infrastructure rebuilding agenda. While his approval rating is at historic heights, there are looming crises emerging at the U.S. southern border, continuing challenges from populist forces, and a recent increase in the number of mass shootings around the country. Today, I am joined by 3 spectacular speakers who have all spent these last 100 days analyzing President Biden's successes and how he is facing challenges surrounding a fraught partisan political landscape, a second year of enduring the COVID-19 pandemic, and reassessing and rebuilding U.S. foreign policy around the world. So I'm so excited and so honored to present today's special guest. First, Matt Viser. Matt Viser is a White House reporter for the Washington Post who has previously covered midterm elections, the presidential campaigns in 2012 and 2016, and more recently, Joe Biden's 2020 presidential campaign. Prior to working for the Washington Post, Viser worked as the deputy chief of the Washington Bureau at the Boston Globe. Ayesha Rascoe is a White House correspondent for NPR who is currently covering her 3rd presidential administration. Prior to joining NPR, Rascoe covered the White House for Reuters, chronicling Obama's final year in office and the beginning days of the Trump administration. And finally, moderating our conversation is someone that I have had the pleasure of working with and learning from this past semester. Janet Hook is a national political reporter for the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Bureau. She has spent most of her career covering Congress and national politics, including the last 3 presidential campaigns and many midterm elections. Previously, she has worked in the Washington Bureau of the Wall Street Journal and at Congressional Quarterly. Thank you, and without further ado, I will now pass it off to our wonderful moderator, Janet Hook, to begin today's discussion.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind of introduction, Nicole. It's been a great pleasure working with you this semester. And Matt and Ayesha, I'm so glad that you could join us tonight. And welcome to our audience, zooming in from wherever you are. Thank you for joining us on this, the sort of, Joe Biden is just about to hit tomorrow, the kind of iconic 100-day landmark of his presidency. And it's kind of an artificial construct that we focus on this as a time to assess how a president is doing. But actually this one, President Biden has himself embraced pretty enthusiastically. In fact, later tonight, he'll be giving his first address to Congress since he's become president, where I'm sure we will hear a lot about what he thinks about his first 100 days. So let's actually start with that. I'm interested in hearing from you, Matt and Ayesha, about what you're expecting from the speech tonight and what you think he needs to accomplish to sort of launch his second 100 days in office. Why don't you start us off, Ayesha?
Tonight, we are going to hear about this so-called American Families Plan, this massive proposal that would, do everything from free universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, free 2-year community college. It would lower taxes for middle and low income families, and, paid family leave, 12 weeks of paid family leave. I mean, it is a basically a wish list of what Democrats have wanted for years and years. And it's, more than $1 trillion, really $1.8 trillion. And that's in addition to the jobs plan, which is over $1 trillion, which is in addition to the $1.9 trillion plan that already passed. So, I mean, what I expect tonight is to hear Biden lay out the reason why he feels like this is the moment to spend this type of money in this type of way and to raise taxes on the rich and to really make that case. Now, whether people will really take it on and, believe it, but that's what he has to sell tonight.
Matt, do you have any thoughts on what it's going to take to get into the next 100 days with some momentum?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of an interesting inflection point, I think, for the Biden presidency, where the first 100 days, he's really focused more than anything else on the coronavirus and the response to that. And his administration has felt like it would, sort of live or die based on their response to it. And I think tonight he will talk a lot about reflecting on that 100 days and kind of putting the country on a much more optimistic posture with vaccinations up, things starting to reopen, the CDC guidance talking about not needing to wear masks in certain cases outdoors. And Biden has met a lot of the metrics that he set for himself, which you can argue were artificially low in some cases, but he's cleared those thresholds that he set on the coronavirus. But tonight is a pivot in a way and a transition into what next and what beyond the coronavirus response. And Ayesha laid out some of those things that are quite ambitious and sweeping, that aren't necessarily having to do with COVID and the COVID economy the way that the $1.9 trillion package was. They're getting into sort of remaking the American economy. And, I think tonight it'll be interesting to hear, how he talks about those things and how he begins to make the case for them and really sort of how Republicans factor into that equation. Because so far there's been meetings with Republicans. He's presented his ideas to Republicans, but there hasn't yet been kind of compromise with Republicans in Congress. And quite frankly, sometimes they have not seemed like they want to make a compromise with him. So that, I think, is kind of the biggest factor potentially for his agenda, or if they continue to, use their thin majorities that the Democrats currently have to push things through. And then just lastly, I think it's like an interesting historical moment for Biden too. I mean, he for almost half a century, he has been in the chamber for these speeches. And for 8 years, he was that figure behind Obama, pointing and laughing and clapping and grabbing Boehner's arm, and tonight he's the one at the microphone, for the first time, and with two women behind him for the first time, having that historic image, I think will be really interesting to see tonight.
Yeah, no, that really is very striking. That's really going to be quite a visual. And that the fact also that both of the women will be masked. Joe Biden will take his mask off to speak, but it's also a reminder that the pandemic is still looms large over everything. So Matt, you kind of said almost in passing about how Biden is trying to remake the economy. Let's talk a little bit about what he's done so far and what his plans entail. He has this tendency to present his plans, especially the things that were in the COVID bill, as sort of pragmatic, problem solving, sometimes even incremental, when in fact, he is proposing things that would drastically change the role of the federal government and the structure of the economy. And part of it, it's almost like he's bringing to an end the era that began with Reagan saying that government is the problem, not the solution. Now he's presenting government as a solution. And what I wonder is whether you two think, is this, is big government back in a permanent sense, or is this just kind of a a shift that just comes out of the sense of urgency about the pandemic and the kind of economic collapse that has followed. Matt, since you brought up remaking the economy, you get to go first on this one.
So it is interesting, and I do think a lot of the stuff that he did with the COVID relief bill was like a window into how he's trying to do some things. The $300 child tax credit was one thing in there that was temporary. It was a year-long thing, or there was the stimulus checks, a one-time infusion of money, and really his next proposals are, in some cases, making trying to make the child care tax credit a little bit more permanent, or it's doing things that do have a lot more lasting impact on the economy. And I do think that Biden is stretching that. I mean, he is kind of remaking what government should mean in the lives of Americans. There's universal pre-K in the Americans Families Plan, or community college for 2 years for free. So there are things in there that I do think change the way that we think about what government will provide. And Jana, as you were talking about Biden and sort of that pragmatic feel, I was reminded of Andrew Yang during the primary said, whatever Joe Biden says becomes the new reasonable. And I think there's this aspect of Biden that does feel, and the way that he presents things don't seem radical, or, I mean, he's called himself a transitional figure, at less than a transitional one. But I think what we're really seeing in a lot of his policies is that they are potentially transformational, and they are, kind of reimagining the American economy. And so, his demeanor, I think, belies some of what he's trying to do, and that may make him successful in being able to get it done, or not. I think that's what is so interesting about tonight and the next couple of months is it's setting up a big battle, between what he's trying to do and I think what Republicans, who are still quite fractured as a party, are going to oppose as he tries to get those things through.
Right. Well, Ayesha, do you think, given the magnitude of the changes that Biden is proposing, is there some way that you can envision him slicing or the next phase of legislation to win Republican support? Or do you think we are just headed into an irretrievably partisan period in Congress?
It will be difficult to win Republican support. And I do believe this White House is aware of that. The way they have approached the whole idea of bipartisanship is to make it less about Congress and more about whether a majority of Americans support the policies. So they have tried to redefine it, I think, because they know how difficult it will be to get Republicans on board, because this is something that, as the party that is not in power, the Republicans have a playbook that they can play, which is to oppose whatever is happening, and try to wait it out till you get to midterms, and maybe they'll take something, that they'll be able to win a chamber, and then they'll be able to be a blockade against success for the Biden administration. And so I do think that Biden is aware of that. What I really wonder is some of what Matt was saying about how Biden does not look or feel as radical as others. He is, we have to say, he is an older white man. So he is not Obama, who was very easy to villainize. He's not a woman. He's not Hillary Clinton, who, had years and years of being villainized and put in a certain place by Republicans. He doesn't have that. Like, people don't dislike Biden that way. So I am interested in whether people are really willing to support policies like universal pre-K, like 2 years of community college. Do they think it's worth spending money on those things? That they do seem to support higher taxes for the rich. That does seem to be fairly popular, even with, non-Democrats. So that to me will be the real test. Will Biden be be able to keep that support from the American people, or from, the majority of Americans, even as he pushes forward with this big government, big spending, because Americans are just in a different place right now, or they don't view Biden that way. They don't view him as a threat or view him as socialism.
So, in addition to the economy and the pandemic, obviously, one of the big dominating issues has been racial justice and inequity, both during the 2020 presidential campaign and after he became president, kind of culminating the emotional and kind of political culmination in Derek Chauvin's conviction last week. So the Black vote and the promises that he made about racial justice were very important to Biden's success in the campaign. And I'm wondering how much you feel like his actions in the first 100 days match up to his aspirations. Ayesha, why don't you start on that one?
When it comes to racial justice, it does seem like the administration has had more to say, had more rhetoric than necessarily action, right? They have an equity executive order that President Biden did sign on his first day in office, where they set up a panel, and they are requiring agencies to look at how they can address racial equity just in the functioning of government. But when you look beyond that, there has been, when it comes to policing, they decided not to go with the commission because there was pushback on that. Right now, he's supporting the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but it's not really clear how that's going to move forward. There is, some negotiations going on in the Senate. There has been some movement, but, is that really a top priority right now? I think that is a place where groups are saying they love the rhetoric, but they want to see more action. They want to see more being done by the Justice Department. There have been now, pattern and practices, invest probes opened by the Justice Department. That is a big shift. But I do think civil rights groups have said they want to see more. They want to see more concrete action from the federal government on this. And I think that is a place where Biden has not necessarily delivered.
And Matt, do you see any short or long-term political risk for Biden or the Democratic Party when an issue that carries so much emotional valence for the base? I mean, is he setting the party up for? Is there a risk that of the disappointment with their actions on this front having political consequences?
But potentially, particularly among the Democratic base, because you do get the sense, I think. He was very clear in his campaign about what he wanted to do, and there was kind of a moment, and it was around George Floyd, and his killing, where Biden, became much more outspoken on a lot of these issues. But simultaneously, to maybe part of your point, Janet, is the defund police movement kind of also kind of took hold around that time too. And Biden resisted that, and potentially that was a pretty politically smart decision, as polling in support of defunding police kind of went down over time. And so I think Biden, he usually can identify pretty well where the party is and where political space may be. But I agree with Ayesha that you haven't heard a lot from Biden in his first 100 days, aside from last week, when the country sort of looked, went through this sort of moment, and Biden spoke to the moment. And I think probably people felt pretty good about how Biden spoke to it. But the action hadn't necessarily been there in the lead up to that. And he's supporting legislation in Congress, but if you ask, is Biden talking to Senator Tim Scott, who's the Republican point of contact on this and getting that through in the Senate, and you don't really get much of an answer from the White House on sort of what Biden specifically is doing to ensure that the George Floyd bill is passed. And so I do think that within the party, if Biden, he does have some room to work with. There is some expectation that you've got to give him time to do these things. But I think that people are a little bit nervous, especially when you hear him say, and this was about gun control, but when you heard him say at his only press conference that it's all about timing. I think for some people it's like, well, when is the time for gun control, if not now, or for police reform, if not now?
Right. Well, it's interesting because it's racial justice and police reform. They're the kind of issues that make getting shots in arm for COVID seem easy. I mean, that's a straightforward problem. It's logistical, it's large, and it's important, but the solution is straightforward, whereas other issues that Biden now has to confront are not so. And another one of those issues, and another one where I think there's been a sense of Biden's well-oiled message and policy machine has kind of gone off the rails, is on immigration. Just there's been the influx of unaccompanied minors at the border, in the sense that the administration was caught off guard, and they're working overtime to not use the word crisis. Why do you two, close as you are to the White House, why do you think they misjudged that problem, or do you think that they didn't quite anticipate what a problem they were going to face when they took office? Either one of you can step up on that one.
Well, I think that there's the clash a little bit in Biden's worldview of wanting the country to be welcoming to immigrants. They've had a similar kind of problem with the refugee cap, where they had it at 15,000. They were going to move it to 62,500, and then they kept it at 15. They've just been sort of all over the place and kind of bungled that, from a messaging perspective and potentially from a policy perspective as well. Where I think Biden has two competing instincts, and one is to sort of showcase that America has a different openness to the world. But you still have people crossing the border and kind of a flood of people that I don't know that they fully anticipated, or that they sort of knew the imagery of that and what that would do, and so I do think that they were caught a little flat-footed on that. And the polling shows, that Biden has pretty good numbers on a lot of things, but not in his handling of border issues. So, but I do think, I just think it's like the contrast of him, trying to show that it's a different country now that he's president and Trump is not, kind of colliding with some of the thorny issues around immigration in this country still.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he has a very different set of expectations on him, obviously, than former President Trump did. Like Matt said, he's trying to show compassion. He's dealing with, the AOCs of the world, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are saying, look, this is unacceptable. He has members of his party who are ready and more than willing to call him out if they feel like things or they feel like people at the border are not being treated humanely, if they do not agree with it. So he has to deal with his own party, who, even if he says, I'm doing the best that I can, who are pushing him to make sure that that these children are being treated humanely. What are you doing? How are you doing it? And so that is a very different situation than what President Trump had to deal with during his time, because the expectations for him were totally different.
Yeah.
Just quickly, Janet, the other thing that struck me in your question was the crisis, the term crisis, which for days or weeks, Jen Psaki avoided that term. They wouldn't call it a crisis. But then there was a moment, maybe 2 weeks ago, where Biden is about to get on an airplane and and he's asked, I think it was about the refugee caps, and he said, well, we also had to deal with the crisis at the border. And so, it's kind of those delightful things where Biden will, he says things a little bit more bluntly than his staff would like, but when you catch him in those unguarded moments, I think he will use the terminology that the rest of the White House is in pretzels over.
Yeah, no, Matt, you've been covering Biden like a blanket for more than 2 years now. And as you know, sometimes the truth comes out unwittingly by Vice President, when he was Vice President Biden. And now as president, he's pretty disciplined. And there aren't many unguarded moments, if only because, there are not many moments of exposure to the press, which actually brings me to a close to home question for both of you. Like, what a weird time to be covering the White House. What an exciting, important, and interesting time. And I thank you for your service. But so you've just got this dramatic change of regime. I mean, you couldn't think of a difference greater than going from Trump to Biden. And also, there's still this pandemic going on. And I don't know, I've been up at Harvard for this semester, so I don't know, what's the press room like? What kind of access? What kind of a weird life do you live now as White House reporters?
It is strange. Now I'm at the White House about once or twice a week. All reporters who go to the White House now have to get tested. So there's like a lottery and there's certain slots. So only a limited amount of reporters can even be at the White House at this point. Obviously, the briefing room is still socially distanced. So I've only been in two briefings this whole administration because, we have to be in the pool, which is the group of reporters that follow the president around that day. And, I have to, be the one who's in there for NPR that day. We have a team. So I've only been there twice, which is very unusual for an administration that is doing daily press briefings. Otherwise you would be in there, every day, right? I would have done multiple times, but now you get in there much less often. You can go to lower press, upper press, and see the press team, but everyone's in mask, which is very different from when Trump was in office. And they even, for one of the guards who's like right outside of upper press, they put him up plexiglass divider, which, I think some colleagues said he was very happy to have that. He did not have that during the Trump administration. So it's different. It's different.
You used the phrase close to home to set up the question, Janet, and it was a nice turn of phrase because I have been close to home, for much of covering Trump, or Biden, and this sort of change in administration. Like Ayesha, we at the Post, we have a team of White House reporters, and we sort of rotate week to week who's on duty to sort of cover everything, and our turn comes up once or twice a week for a briefing room seat, and people who watch that on TV can notice, the room is very small anyways, and that's sort of the one thing that I feel like my first impression walking into that room, years ago was it's so tiny, it's a small room, but it's not filled with many people these days, and so you don't get the kind of free-flowing kind of access that it typically exists, especially in a changeover in administration when you have all new players and characters and people who are new. In this case, a lot of the people are occupying former offices or they're coming back, because they'd worked in the Obama administration. But it's a much different type of environment just in terms of talking to people. It's done much more on phones or Zooms these days than it is, kind of actually being in the building, with the president and the whole apparatus around him.
And
You
a
know,
Zoom coffee is very different from, actually meeting up with someone for coffee, because they can just say, "Oh, we gotta go," and like cut the Zoom off. It's easier to kind of duck people.
it's so funny, this whole Zoom period, while I was reporting at home, covering the campaign at home, I kept having in my mind that everybody else was where they were supposed to be. And so like in my mind, Matt and Ayesha are there in the press room, but not. Now I see you're at home.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So another thing I'm really curious about is what you guys think about Kamala Harris's role. Obviously, history was made when Biden picked her to be his running mate, first Black, first woman, first Asian American. And you kind of see her everywhere. He speaks, she's standing right next to him. They tell us that she's in every meeting. But I'm wondering, what impact do you really feel like she's making? Like, we see her face, but where do you see her fingerprints?
It seems like that's still not defined yet, and maybe Matt will have a different perspective, but I feel like her office and the vice president is still figuring out what that role is going to be and look like. She has embraced certain issues like childcare. I went up with her to Massachusetts for or was it Connecticut? It was Connecticut. It was New Haven, I think. Up there, and where she visited a child care center. She has talked a lot about that, talked about her experience, going, how her mother was only able to do her work as a cancer researcher because she had, a woman who was able, who kept them in the neighborhood. So she has had these issues, and obviously now she's also the diplomatic lead for the Northern Triangle and dealing with those issues, which is a very high profile position, but also something that is putting a target on her back, because all Republicans can keep saying is, when are you going to the border? And they do try to be very clear. She's not over the border crisis. She's over the diplomatic efforts, but that sort of nuance is easy to get lost. I think they're still trying to figure out exactly what her role is going to be.
My impression is similar to Ayesha's, where I think it's clear that she is in these meetings. She's in the room. She's with Biden a lot. And I think she has a presence in there. I think we're still trying to scratch, past that to figure out like what types of pieces of advice is she giving, or what decisions is she shaping specifically, and that I feel like is still a little bit nebulous in sort of figuring out like if she's guiding him in any particular direction or not. But you do get the sense where Biden is really setting her up as his heir, over the Democratic Party, which is kind of fascinating, and it's an interesting moment to sort of watch that, because he has, sort of put her under his wing. The other thing is like her staff is mostly people who the Biden, administration has put with her. She's not somebody who comes into the administration with a David Axelrod, the way that Obama had. There's not like a big mastermind behind her political career that is sort of with her, guiding her all of the time. So she's really a part of the administration, and her staff is quite similarly part of the administration.
Right. I mean, and she's in a little bit of an awkward political position because, the Biden people don't want her like already looking like she's running for president on the assumption that he's not running for a second term. But as my LA Times colleague Noah Bierman noted recently, one thing that you don't hear is remember during the campaign, the Republicans were saying, oh, Kamala Harris, she's going to be the puppet master behind Joe Biden, that she's really going to be calling the shots. Well, she may be having impact, but it's clear that Joe Biden is calling his own shots. So much to cover. Before we go to student questions, I wanted to ask you guys one thing about foreign policy and defense. Obviously, among the many, many ways in which Biden has brought huge change to the White House is he's got a completely different take on foreign policy and the America's role in the world. and has done a lot very quickly to kind of reestablish it as a global leader, whether it's climate change or the World Health Organization. On the other hand, he moved very quickly to establish a firm deadline for withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan in his own version of America First. We're done with the forever war. So I'm wondering, do you see any signs of like what the Biden doctrine is?
I sort of feel like, loosely, he's a little bit skeptical of sometimes American intervention, militarily, which students of Biden's history may point to his vote for the Iraq War, and say that that's an example, a counterexample. But I do think the Afghanistan thing is an indication of him wanting to pull American troops out of Afghanistan. But he is very much in support of American, leadership, and sort of re-engaging in kind of bringing the world together. You saw that last week on climate. He always had this line in the campaign about on day one, he'll call NATO and say, we're back, and so I think him and like global alliances, I think, is something that he's very much, a part of, and trying to export, democracy, and sort of show American democracy and that it can work, but militarily, in terms of engaging with other countries, in that way, I feel like his instincts are to kind of can be somewhat similar to Trump's.
Yeah. So go ahead, Ayesha.
And there's a lot less bluster, right? Not surprisingly, even when it came to Russia, there was sanctions, there was a talk, but there wasn't the bluster that you would have heard, or maybe not necessarily towards Russia, but that you would have heard towards other countries when it came to the former president. And just this idea of the U.S. cannot counter counter China alone. So you see the re-engagement with the Quad, and making sure that the allies, everything is about the allies. We're working in partnership with our allies. Every foreign policy question is going to include that. In deep consultation with our allies, we are going to do this. But clearly a belief that by working with other countries, the U.S. can counter some of these issues, like when it comes to North Korea, Russia, China, which is very different than than the approach that the Trump administration took.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you one last question, and then we can go to some student questions. One area where Trump made obviously a huge impact that long exceeds his term in office is in the federal judiciary. And I was wondering, how much have we learned anything about what Biden's approach is going to be to filling judicial appointments?
Yes, and I think that he is learning lessons from Trump, and learning lessons from Obama and what Obama didn't do. Like his White House has put forward a slate of judges, a significant slate, early on, and earlier than most presidents, including Trump. But by this point, Biden has nominated more federal judges than Trump had. And so I think that their intention is to fill judicial vacancies and try to begin remaking the courts in a democratic view. And so you're seeing early signs of them prioritizing that in a way that Democrats hadn't in the past. The one other area that's a little bit tricky for Democrats right now is whether to expand the Supreme Court or to make big changes there. And Biden has kind of punted on that. He's formed a commission that's like, I think 35 people, and they're going to study it. They're going to come up with a report, but not make recommendations. So it's all set up to be pretty squishy, in terms of whether or not he would get on board for some big change, which I think animates some Democrats that want to, they're nervous about the makeup of the current Supreme Court and the lasting impacts that Trump and the justices that he placed there may have.
Classic Washington solution to a problem, name a commission. Well, so I think let's start taking questions from our student in the audience. And our first question is from Ajay, who is a student at the college, who I know well. Hi, Ajay.
Janet. It's always a pleasure. So my name is Ajay. I'm a sophomore at the college, calling in from right outside of Jacksonville, Florida. And my question today is about something both of you actually alluded to a little earlier, which is that general malaise around the situation at the border, the crisis that the Biden administration doesn't like to call a crisis, and that the sort of the way that both progressives have complained about the treatment of especially unaccompanied minors at the border, and the Republican narrative that the country is being overrun by undocumented individuals. The Biden administration sort of promises that once they've repaired the asylum system and brought it back to where it was before the Trump administration, and once Vice President Harris has negotiated a deal with the Northern Triangle countries, the promise is that a lot of these things will be resolved. But my question is, do we think that this issue will come back to, for lack of a better way of phrasing things, bite Biden in the butt in the presidential, the 2024 election, if Republicans can sort of weaponize this to revive a nationalism very much rooted in the opposition to immigration that was weaponized in the 2016 election.
I sort of think yes, like it can definitely be weaponized, and maybe by the same person who weaponized it in 2016. I do feel like Trump, sort of used the border to resounding political impact, and it I don't know that it quite worked in 2018 in the midterms. He kept talking about the caravans coming, and like he went back to that playbook, and it didn't quite work as well when he wasn't on the ballot. But I don't know what the lasting solution is. And for Democrats, it's often been, there was the 2013 kind of big immigration reform bill, and Marco Rubio was a part of that, and he's kind of no longer on board for something like that. And John McCain was on that, and he's not with us anymore. And Lindsey Graham was with that, and but the deal was always going to be, sort of enhanced border security in trade for DACA or for like other immigration priorities, and it didn't work. And now some Democrats are talking about dealing with things piecemeal, which doesn't set itself up for sort of a broader immigration overhaul. But I don't know. Like I do think Republicans have been quite effective at weaponizing the issue.
Our next question comes from Kanan, who's a student at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government.
Thank you.
Kanan?
It's a very greatest opportunity for me to see you people. Actually, I'm from India. Actually, my question is, what's the outcome of Quad Summit recently submitted? What they're expecting to do in Indo-Pacific region? So this is my main question regarding Biden's administration right now. Apart from that, the global pandemic scenario, how they are handling this is a very important thing right now.
So you're asking about us to assess the administration's handling of the global pandemic?
Yes.
Oh, the global. Well, it does seem like you did have that call with Biden and Modi recently, and now they are sending help to India to try to address, the horrific situation there. This has been one of those areas where Biden has been more America first. There was a lot of questions about why the administration was not as quick to start trying to allow some more vaccines to be sent abroad. Other countries like Russia and China have been more generous with their neighbors, and there's an idea that they have been using that to maybe show their influence. And so why hasn't the US led the way in that? They do seem to be, now that the US is in a place where the vaccine supply is very steady, and now the US may have more of a demand issue. They seem to be more open to that, but there have been a lot of questions, and it did seem like Biden was playing a bit from an America first. We're going to look out for our people first before we start trying to send a lot of help abroad.
Yes, thank you.
And our next question comes from Aya, who is a student at the college. Hello, Aya.
Hi.
Where are you zooming in from?
From Rancho Cucamonga. So I'm a sophomore at the college. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to ask about foreign policy. How successful has Biden been in repairing damage done to America's image by Donald Trump? And are our allies apprehensive when it comes to seeking partnerships with the Biden administration because of the potential of another nationalist presidency succeeding him?
I sort of think you're seeing a little bit of that. Probably the climate conference seems to be the big, that was sort of Biden's biggest reintroduction to the world, at least that we've been able to see. He's done a lot of foreign leader calls, but I know from John Kerry, feels like there's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of rebuilding trust. That the United States is going to be committed to actually, living up to the Paris Climate Accords, because the world already saw us as a country pull out 4 years ago to something that everybody else kind of thought we were all on board as a global environment, to do. So I think Kerry's view is that they've had to do a lot, and that they're not done. And you're seeing a lot of countries not increase their goals because the United States, hasn't yet. And to the latter part of your question, I do think that gets at an uncertainty over who will be president and who will win the next election, because you've seen these sort of head-snapping changes in American foreign policy over the past 6 or 8 years, and so I don't know that it how the world trusts that whatever Biden is doing is going to be American policy in 3 years from now.
Good question, Aya. Thank you. Our next question comes from a college alum, AM. AM, are you there? Can you turn on your video?
Hello. Hi. Yeah, I'm zooming in from Los Angeles. And so my question for you is, so historically, and especially on the campaign trail, President Biden framed himself as very prone for bipartisanship. The great uniter is what people called him. And I wanted to ask, are there ways to secure this while getting legislation passed on issues like infrastructure? I've also noticed that many have started to question whether bipartisanship even ought to be a priority right now. And with the support for the use of budget reconciliation, does that maybe suggest that President Biden is questioning the value of bipartisanship?
It seems like President Biden wants to show that he is committed to at least having negotiations. He's committed to reaching out, but he does not seem to want to be chained to bipartisanship to the point of not being able to carry out his agenda. So what he has shown is he will do the reaching out. He will say, do you, if you have some other suggestions, we're open to it. But he is not willing to necessarily hold his agenda hostage to that. It does seem like, and it may be necessary because it's not just bipartisanship. He has to make sure he has the votes for, these big things that he wants to do. And it's not clear that he has the votes in his party, because you have a very tight, you have a very limited majority in the House and a very thin majority in the Senate. And so, you have to look at, the Senator Mansions of the world, Senator Sinema, and you have to see he could very easily, he has to make sure that he has them on board as well. And right now there are signs that they are not, or definitely Manchin may not be on board with all of this spending. Some things may have to be pared down. There may have to be some things done that are piecemeal to actually get something done. But that's really the challenge for Biden right now.
If I could just add, the thing about bipartisanship versus partisanship, this isn't a new problem for American politics. I mean, I would like to point out that, Biden is not the first president to pass important legislation with only votes from his own party. The Trump tax cut passed entirely with Republican votes. Obamacare, the healthcare bill, passed entirely with Democratic votes. So for the last decade, this has been the reality. And Biden's problem is really more that he doesn't have enough Democrats to do as much as he wants to do. I guess the problem for him is that he talked up bipartisanship so much. But I got to say, one of the more masterful PR things that he's accomplished in these first 3 months is presenting this alternative definition of bipartisanship. It's not getting Republican votes in Congress, it's getting Republican support in the country. And amazingly, his first big bill, filled with all of its radical progressive proposals, was exceedingly popular, even among many Republicans.
Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you, I am. Our next question comes from another Harvard alum, Bridget. Are you there, Bridget? Where is Bridget? Bridget, are you able to unmute? I guess not. Okay. Well, Bridget, maybe you can come back later. And in the meantime, looks like we have a question from another Harvard student that I know well from my IOP experience, is Michael Back. Hello, Michael.
Hi. One thing that Janet has been wondering about, and I'd love to hear the full panel's perspective on, is where you guys, the much maligned, recently mainstream media, go in this future world. I mean, from what I understand, Tucker Carlson has been doing all right for ratings, but how the press can sort of regain a place of trust in the and for that matter, interest in this country with the new administration. I think that one thing that's been often said is, the presidency is boring again, politics is boring again. What's the sort of like the game plan for journalism, or is it more or less stay the course? And that's a perfectly reasonable game plan as well. Journalism didn't do the worst job during the Trump administration at keeping him accountable.
Folks, speak up for our profession, please.
I don't know. Like, I think that highlights. I mean, the what's behind your question is a tricky one, and I think one way to look at it, I do think that Trump was, the interest, in some cases, the outrage at what he was doing created a new appetite for people to read. And, I know at the Post, our readership went way up, and we got tons of new subscribers. And it's the same, I think throughout the media landscape. I think there has been criticism, not criticism, but Biden has been kind of branded as more boring, and I don't know that it's boring necessarily, but I think that it's our jobs to make what he's doing interesting and relevant to people, and covering the White House and covering his policies to make it to showcase what about them are interesting, because they're massive amounts of spending and massive amounts of government intervention into American lives, and trying to make people realize what that's about. And then this is kind of rambling and an answer that's not concise to your question, but I also think that I hope that what Trump and sort of the lessons from that are accountability. And at the Post, we had our fact checker like round the clock. I mean, there was a ton amount of checking things that he was saying, and that hasn't stopped with Biden. He doesn't sort of outright lie as much as Trump did, but he still tries to get away with an awful lot, and some of his things may be a little bit more good-natured or, more gaffes than but I think that we still have a responsibility to provide a check on what he's doing as president and what his administration is doing.
It is going to be, the Trump years were unique because people were so outraged. People were so worked up. You could go anywhere and you mention the name Trump and you could have an hour-long conversation with the Uber driver, your aunt, your grandma, whoever, because everybody was so worked up about him one way or the other. And I never saw people so engaged. They knew everything that was happening. They knew who the press secretary was, who this person, the chief of staff was. They knew everybody. I don't think any other administration is necessarily going to match that. Obviously, there was a lot of interest in the Obama administration because he was the first Black president. But even I think the Trump era was just different. I don't know necessarily though that it was great for certain outlets, and including NPR, who had record listeners and things of that nature. But as far as the trust, I think in some ways it helped, and I think some ways people saw the value of media, but it also fed into this very polarized setting where people felt like either the press was way too soft on Trump or way too hard on him and never gave him a chance. And I think it in some ways it is very difficult to provide the news to a country that is as divided as it is and to be trusted. And I think that the media still has to figure that out. And sometimes I think trust may be different from popularity. If that makes sense, or sometimes trust can be popular because you like what you're being told, but not necessarily because it's true.
Right.
And so I think that's tough.
Great. Well, that will have to be our last question. Thanks to everybody for asking such great questions and for joining us for this discussion. And Matt and Ayesha, thank you so much for coming, and good luck and have fun covering the speech tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time out. And we'll have some closing comments first from Anan Hafez, who is the student chair of the JFK Forum. Anan?
Thank you so much, Janet. And thank you to everyone for joining the final forum of our spring semester. I'm so proud of what we've been able to accomplish as a committee this semester, despite all the challenges that come with being online students during the pandemic. Our forum team joins us from different countries, different time zones, and very diverse academic and cultural backgrounds. And this has allowed us to create some incredible events with speakers and leaders from all walks of life, from every corner of the world and even outer space, and all over the political spectrum as we share these conversations with the IOP community. To highlight some of my favorites, last week, we brought in my close friend Jingjing Shen, who is the student chair of the Harvard Public Opinion Project, to share the findings of the nationally acclaimed Harvard Youth Poll that they've been working so hard on building for the past year. We were honored to host and celebrate several discussions during Black History Month, Women's History Month, Arab American History Month, and Asian Pacific Heritage Month with guests such as NASA astronauts Jenny Epps and Charles Bolden, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Queen Rania of Jordan, for International Women's Day, activist and founder of RISE, and also former Forum Committee member, Amanda Nguyen, and CBS News' Weijia Zhang. In conversation, we had former Secretary of Health and Human Services and Representative Donna Shalala, along with Colorado State Representative Iman Jude, and many more, obviously. These forums are not just a time to celebrate, but to engage. We find ourselves at a truly peculiar time in history. We find ourselves at a moment where many are distressed about the level of violence in our country, about the depth of division in our country, about the breadth of discord in our country. We are at a time when the courageous conversations and leadership lessons of the dozens of forums we have put together this semester are all the more urgent, all the more relevant, all the more important. Not just for the students, but for the guests that join us in discussion nearly every evening. It has been my honor thus far to serve as the chair of this beautiful IOP tradition, and I am so excited for the upcoming fall semester where we'll continue to host some wonderful guests and discussions. I'd also like to extend a warm thank you to our forum seniors who have helped play a huge role in shaping our community and the forum for the past 4 years. Thank you to Lyle, to Braden, Brinkley, Chia, Emmanuel, Yvonne, Miu, and Sewon. You all will be dearly missed. But to conclude tonight's forum, I'll pass it off to a good friend of mine, the IOP director, Mr. Mark Gearin.
Well, thank you, Anand, and thank you for those beautiful remarks and for your leadership. This forum would not be as vibrant or interesting without your leadership. So thank you most sincerely. I will be brief. First, let me thank Janet for moderating this wonderful and fascinating and important conversation, and for all you gave to our students as a fellow this semester. We look forward to staying in touch, staying engaged, and getting you back on campus when we're all on campus indeed. And then to Ayesha and to Matt, Janet said it well when she thanked you for your service. And I join in that appreciation. What you do each and every day from my time as a White House staff member, I know how hard you work, particularly in these circumstances. But you make an enormous difference in informing the citizenry, and I thank you most especially. Anand certainly summed up the year. It's been a remarkable one on important topics. We appreciate the student leadership, the student engagement, and the moderation that they brought to several important panels, to our faculty colleagues that joined in moderating sessions, and to those other moderators we brought in. So there have been key topics. We hope we have honored our mission at the Institute of Politics, which is to inspire Harvard undergraduates to politics, to public service, and to pursue lives committed to the public good. So for all those reasons, we have been so proud of the JFK Jr. Forum and the sessions that we had honoring President Kennedy as the living memorial the Institute is, on focus on the Peace Corps, the space program, particular initiatives that his leadership is so important. And finally, I'd like to thank, in addition to our student leaders from our executive committee, my colleagues on the staff, Nanda Chitra, Kathy Park, and Morgan Burke. From our forum and communications teams, they made it all so effortlessly in tandem with our student leaders. So finally, we thank those who've been able to join us, as Anand said, from across the planet. With year, next semester, hopefully more and more exchange ideas, have important dialogue, and ask these very good questions. So thank you very much again, Janet. Thank you so much. Ayesha and Matt, good luck with your important work. Good luck for tonight's coverage. And thank you all. Good night.